The heavy, stagnant air of Blackwood Penitentiary was thick with the scent of floor wax, industrial bleach, and the low-frequency hum of 1,000 desperate men. Inside the concrete labyrinth of Block 6, time didn't move in hours, but in the slow erosion of a man's dignity. At the center of this world was Arthur, a man who looked like he had been carved from brittle parchment. At 75, Arthur was the oldest inmate in the facility, a man whose presence was a quiet anomaly in a place defined by noise and violence. He didn't belong here, but the system didn't care about age, it only cared about the sentence. Arthur's life was tethered to a small, plastic bottle of heart medication, 6 pills a day that kept his fragile pulse from stuttering into a permanent silence. To the guards, it was just a prescription; to Arthur, it was the only bridge back to a world he still hoped to see. The hierarchy of Block 6 was dominated by a crew known as the Scavengers, led by a man named Silas. Silas wasn't the biggest man in the prison, but he was the most opportunistic. He understood that in a place where you have nothing, even a man's life-saving medicine has a price. On a Tuesday afternoon, during the chaotic transition from the mess hall to the afternoon yard, Silas and his crew cornered Arthur in the narrow corridor near the laundry. They didn't want his food or his meager credits. They wanted the bottle. Silas knew that the medication contained compounds that could be crushed and sold as a substitute for more expensive contraband. With a jagged laugh, he snatched the bottle from Arthur's trembling hands, leaving the old man gasping for breath against the cold stone wall. Arthur tried to plead, his voice a dry rasp that barely carried over the clanging of the cell doors. He told Silas that without those pills, his heart would fail within 48 hours. He explained that it wasn't a choice, but a biological necessity. But Silas only smirked, tossing the bottle to one of his enforcers like a trophy. He told Arthur that in Blackwood, the only thing that was necessary was the tax. He walked away, leaving the old man slumped against the wall, clutching his chest as the first pangs of anxiety and physical strain began to take hold. The guards, watching from the high gantries, didn't intervene. In their eyes, it was just another day of inmate-on-inmate friction, a problem that usually resolved itself with a body bag. However, the Scavengers had forgotten one critical detail: the man who lived in the cell directly across from Arthur. His name was Elias, but everyone in the prison called him the Giant. Elias was a man of few words and terrifying proportions. Standing nearly 7 feet tall with shoulders that seemed to span the width of the corridor, he was a mountain of a man who had spent 15 years in Blackwood without joining a single gang or participating in a single riot. He existed in a state of self-imposed isolation. A silent titan who moved through the yard like a ghost that no one dared to touch. Elias had watched Arthur for months, silent and observant. He saw the way the old man shared his bread with the stray birds in the yard and the way he spoke about his grandchildren with a flickering light in his eyes. When Elias saw the Scavengers leave the corridor with Arthur's medication, something that had been dormant for a decade began to stir. It wasn't just anger, it was a profound, visceral sense of injustice that bypassed his usual stoicism. He stepped out of his cell, his shadow stretching long and jagged across the floor, completely eclipsing the light from the narrow windows. He walked over to Arthur, who was now struggling to stay upright, his face a pale shade of gray. Elias didn't say a word. He simply placed a hand the size of a dinner plate on Arthur's shoulder, a gesture that felt like the weight of an anchor. He guided the old man back to his cot, making sure he was comfortable, and then he turned toward the door. The atmosphere in Block 6 shifted instantly. Inmates who had been shouting and laughing suddenly fell silent as Elias walked toward the common area. He didn't run, he moved with a slow, rhythmic deliberateness that made the very air feel heavy. Every step was a declaration of war. He wasn't looking for a fight, he was looking for a specific bottle. The Giant had broken his silence, and the raw power radiating from him was more terrifying than any weapon Silas could have fashioned in the machine shop. The word spread through the tiers like a wildfire: the Giant is out, and he's looking for the Scavengers. Elias found Silas and his crew in the recreation room, where they were already attempting to dismantle the medication bottle. The room was filled with the usual suspects: gamblers, dealers, and the desperate. But as Elias crossed the threshold, the crowd parted like a Red Sea. Silas looked up, his initial smirk fading into a mask of pure, unadulterated terror as he saw the expression on Elias's face. It wasn't the face of a man who was angry, it was the face of a man who had become an instrument of divine retribution. Silas tried to bluster, telling Elias to stay in his lane and mind his own business, but the giant didn't respond with words. Elias reached out, and before Silas could even raise a hand to defend himself, the giant had him by the throat. The strength in Elias's grip was absolute, a biological vice that rendered Silas's struggle meaningless. He lifted the gang leader off the floor as if he weighed nothing, his eyes locked on Silas's with a cold, terrifying clarity. Elias didn't squeeze to kill, not yet. He simply held him there, a silent testament to the fact that the hierarchy of Blackwood had just been dismantled. The other members of the scavengers stood frozen, their knives and shivs remaining tucked away. Paralyzed by the sheer scale of the giant's wrath, the giant's voice finally broke the silence, a low, tectonic rumble that seemed to come from the deep foundations of the prison itself. He didn't ask for the medication, he commanded the air to return what had been stolen. He told Silas that for every minute Arthur went without his pills, a different bone in Silas's body would pay the price. He spoke with the certainty of a man who had already decided the outcome. The enforcer holding the bottle didn't hesitate, he dropped the pills and backed away, his hands raised in a gesture of total surrender. The giant's wrath was not a chaotic explosion, it was a focused, relentless pressure that left no room for negotiation. Elias took the bottle from the floor without ever breaking eye contact with Silas. He then dropped the gang leader to the ground like a piece of discarded waste. He didn't look back as Silas gasped for air, and he didn't acknowledge the hundreds of eyes watching him. He walked back to the medical wing, the bottle clutched safely in his massive palm. The innocent old man was no longer just a target, he was the ward of a man who had rediscovered his purpose. As the sun began to set behind the high barbed wire fences, the giant sat in the chair outside Arthur's cell, a silent sentinel who had redefined the meaning of power in Block 6. The aftermath of the giant's intervention was not a return to order, but a deepening of the silence that gripped Block 6. While Arthur sat on his cot, his trembling hands finally steady as the life-saving medication began to circulate through his system, the rest of the prison waited for the inevitable hammer of the administration to fall. Warden Miller, a man who viewed his inmates as nothing more than cattle to be branded and broken, could not allow such a blatant display of unofficial power to go unpunished. To Miller, it didn't matter that Elias had saved a man's haywire heart. What mattered was that Elias had shattered the carefully cultivated climate of fear that kept the prison running. By the time the night shift rolled in, the tactical teams were already assembling at the end of the corridor, their black armor gleaming like beetle shells under the flickering fluorescent lights. Warden Miller entered the block not with a conversation, but with a declaration of war. He stood behind a line of guards armed with high-pressure gas canisters and rubber bullet shotguns, his eyes fixed on the massive figure of Elias sitting outside Arthur's cell. Miller's voice boomed over the intercom, calling Elias by his inmate number and demanding that he surrender for immediate transfer to the hole, the deep, windowless solitary units where men went to lose their minds. The warden claimed that Elias had initiated an unprovoked assault on Silas and disrupted the security of the wing. He didn't mention the stolen medication. In Miller's record books, the old man's life was an acceptable loss, but the giant's defiance was an existential threat. Elias didn't move. He sat in his plastic chair, his hands resting on his knees like two boulders, his gaze fixed on the warden with an unnerving calm. He knew that if he stepped away from that door, the scavengers would return to finish what they started, emboldened by the warden's protection. Beside him, through the bars, Arthur whispered for Elias to save himself, his voice cracking with a mixture of gratitude and terror. But the giant only closed his eyes for a moment, a silent acknowledgement that some debts are paid in years, and others are paid in blood. When he opened them again, the raw, tectonic power of his resolve had intensified. He told the warden, in a voice that carried through the entire block, that he wasn't going anywhere until Arthur was moved to the medical wing for permanent observation. The standoff reached a fever pitch. The tactical team took their positions, the clacking of their weapons chambering rounds echoing through the tiers. The inmates in the surrounding cells, men who had spent years looking at the floor whenever a guard walked by, began to stir. They had watched Elias stand up for a man who had nothing to offer in return. They had seen a giant risk his own life for a bottle of pills. A low, rhythmic drumming began to build, a collective pounding of fists against cell doors and metal bunks. It wasn't a riot of chaos, but a riot of solidarity. For the first time in Blackwood's history, the predator-prey dynamic had been replaced by a singular, unified defiance. The message was clear: if they took the giant, they would have to take every man in Block 6. Warden Miller's face turned a violent shade of crimson. He ordered the guards to deploy the gas. But as the first canister was raised, something happened that stopped the clock. Officer Vance, a veteran guard who had worked the tiers for 20 years and had always respected Elias's quiet nature, stepped in front of the line. He didn't draw his weapon. Instead, he turned his back on the giant and faced the warden. Vance told Miller that the men were right, that the internal report on the incident had already been leaked to the state's medical board by an anonymous source. He warned the warden that if he fired on an inmate who was protecting a man's right to medical care, the fallout would be seen on every news channel in the country by morning. The silence that followed was heavy, a suffocating weight that seemed to suck the oxygen out of the hallway. Miller looked at Vance, then at the hundreds of inmates who were now standing at their bars, their eyes burning with a newfound sense of humanity. He realized that his authority was a hollow shell held together by the threat of violence. And that tonight, the threat was no longer enough. The giant had not only defeated Silas, he had broken the warden's hold over the very soul of the prison. With a snarl of defeat, Miller ordered the tactical teams to stand down. He knew that to push any further would be to ignite a fire that would burn the entire institution to the ground. The resolution was swift and unprecedented. Arthur was moved to the medical wing under the personal supervision of Officer Vance, ensuring that his heart would be monitored and his medication protected. Elias was not sent to the hole. Instead, he was moved to a high-security detail that gave him the autonomy to watch over the vulnerable inmates of the block. He had become more than just a prisoner. He was the unofficial guardian of Blackwood, a silent sentinel who ensured that the weak were no longer prey for the vultures. The scavengers were dismantled, their influence evaporated the moment the giant proved that fear was a currency that could be devalued. As the weeks passed, a new kind of order settled over Block 6. It wasn't the order of the boot or the baton, but the order of a hard-earned respect. Arthur, his health stabilized, spent his days in the medical garden, often looking up at the high windows where he knew Elias was watching. The giant remained a man of few words, but his presence was a constant reminder that even in the darkest corners of the earth, the light of justice could be sparked by a single act of courage. He had lost 15 years of his life to a concrete cage, but in defending a frail old man, he had finally found his freedom. On the day Elias was eventually granted a parole hearing, a result of the widespread public support following the incident, he walked out of the gates of Blackwood for the first time in 2 decades. He didn't look back at the walls or the wire. He looked toward the horizon, where Arthur was waiting for him in a small, modest car, the sun reflecting off the old man's glasses. They didn't need to speak. The giant took his place in the passenger seat, his massive frame barely fitting in the small space. And they drove away from the shadow of the prison. The wrath of the giant had passed, leaving behind a legacy of peace that would be whispered in the halls of Blackwood for generations to come.